So I got fired yesterday morning at 9 a.m. from the warehouse job I've had for 8 months. Manager said I was late one too many times and handed me my final paycheck. Instead of going to the unemployment office or calling anyone to vent, I decided to just head home and figure out my next move. I'm 24 and been living with my parents since college ended, paying them $400 a month in rent for what used to be my childhood bedroom. I walked through the front door at 11 a.m. and heard voices coming from upstairs. Loud voices. I climbed the stairs and found the door to my room wide open with my entire family inside. My sister Blair was standing there holding my desk lamp and my gaming headset, talking to my mom Jessica about how perfect this corner would be for her easel. My brother Jackson was sitting on my bed with my laptop open, scrolling through my Steam library like he was window shopping. My dad George was unscrewing my wall-mounted TV. The moment they saw me standing in the doorway, the room went completely silent. Then Blair broke into this massive grin and practically shouted that finally the loser was gone and she could have a real art studio. My mom started explaining how they figured I wouldn't be back until evening and wanted to surprise me with the room conversion. My dad just kept unscrewing the TV mount like I wasn't even there. I asked them what exactly they thought they were doing with my stuff in my room that I pay rent for. Blair rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic as usual. She explained how everyone knew I was going to get fired eventually because I'm always complaining about work and showing up late, and they decided weeks ago that she needed this space more than I did. She's 22 and been unemployed for 6 months, spending her days making digital art on her iPad and posting it to Instagram for her 12 followers. My mom jumped in with this whole speech about how Blair has real artistic talent and deserves a dedicated creative space. Unlike me who just plays video games and watches Netflix, she said they were going to convert the basement into a bedroom for me, since I obviously can't afford anything better anyway. Jackson finally looked up from my laptop and said he called dibs on keeping it, since I'd probably just pawn it when I get desperate for money. The thing is, I've been planning for this exact moment for 3 years. See, my grandmother died when I was 21 and left me something in her will that my family has no idea about. Something that completely changes who has power in this house. But instead of getting angry or arguing, I just stood there grinning at them. I told them this was actually perfect timing and asked if they minded if I made a quick phone call. My dad finally turned around from the TV and asked what kind of phone call. I said just some paperwork stuff, nothing too exciting. Blair demanded to know what I was being so weird about and why I was smiling like an idiot when my life was falling apart. Here's where it gets interesting. I pulled out my phone and called the law office that's been handling my grandmother's estate. I asked them if they could move up that appointment we had scheduled for next month. I told them I needed someone to come by tomorrow morning around 10 a.m. with the documents we discussed. My family was staring at me like I'd lost my mind. My mom asked what documents and what appointment. I said it was just some boring inheritance stuff from Grandma that I'd been putting off dealing with. Just some old lady paperwork that needed signatures. Blair laughed and said Grandma never left any of us anything, except her ugly jewelry that Mom already took. Jackson said Grandma probably left me her collection of church cookbooks, since that's about all I was worth to her. My dad asked why I needed a lawyer to come to the house for cookbook inheritance. I explained it wasn't cookbooks exactly, more like property paperwork, legal stuff that required notarizing and signatures, the kind of documents that establish ownership of things. Blair asked ownership of what, since Grandma lived in that tiny apartment and didn't have anything valuable. I looked around my room at my family, dividing up my belongings, and asked them if they wanted to know a secret about this house, about who actually owns it now. My mom said of course they owned it. They bought it 18 years ago and have been paying the mortgage ever since. I nodded and said that's what I thought too, until I met with Grandma's lawyers 3 years ago. The expression on their faces when I explained that Grandma had quietly purchased the house from the bank 2 years before she died and put it in her will was absolutely priceless. That she left it to the grandchild she felt needed it most, the one who visited her every week and helped with her groceries and doctor appointments while the rest of the family only called on holidays. My dad said that was impossible because they still get mortgage statements every month. I told him to check who those payments actually go to now. Blair demanded to know what I was trying to say. I explained that they've been paying rent to me for 3 years without knowing it, just like I've been paying rent to them. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., someone's going to knock on this door with papers that prove everything I just told them. Papers that show exactly who owns this house and who's been living here as tenants. My mom asked what kind of papers. I said eviction notices if they keep treating me like garbage, or new lease agreements if they want to start showing some respect. The room got very quiet after that. Jackson closed my laptop and set it back on the desk. Blair put down my lamp and headset. My dad stopped unscrewing the TV mount. My mom asked if I was serious about this whole inheritance thing. I picked up my backpack from the floor and Told them I guess they'll find out tomorrow morning when the doorbell rings. Update 1. The responses to my last post blew up my phone all night. Shout out to the guy who said my family sounds like parasites who need a reality check. You were absolutely right. And to everyone asking if this is real, buckle up because it gets so much better. So after I dropped that bomb about owning the house, my family spent the entire evening trying to corner me and get more information. My mom kept following me around asking what exactly Grandma left me and why I never mentioned it before. I told her she'd find out soon enough and went to bed early. I could hear them having heated discussions in the living room until past midnight about whether I was lying or had lost my mind. Around 7 a.m. this morning, my dad knocked on my door and asked if we could talk man to man. He sat on my bed and started explaining how the family has been under financial stress for months. He lost his construction job back in February, and my mom's hours got cut at the medical office where she works. Blair hasn't contributed anything to household expenses since she graduated college, and Jackson just started community college, so he's not working. My dad said they were counting on my $400 rent payments to help cover utilities and groceries. Then he asked if this inheritance thing was real, and if so, could we work out some kind of arrangement where I help them instead of making things difficult? He said he understood I was upset about them going through my room, but they were just trying to solve space problems in the house. Blair needed somewhere to focus on her art career, and the basement really would be a better fit for a single guy my age. I looked at my dad and asked him when exactly he planned to tell me that they'd already decided to move me to the basement before yesterday. He got quiet for a minute, and then admitted they'd been discussing it for about 2 weeks. They figured I'd be okay with it since I don't really do anything except work and play video games anyway. He said Blair's art had real potential and deserved priority in the family. That's when my mom appeared in the doorway asking what we were talking about. My dad explained that he was trying to understand the inheritance situation and work out a fair solution for everyone. My mom sat down on my desk chair and said she'd been thinking about this all night. She asked why Grandma would leave me the house instead of her own daughter, meaning my mom. She said it didn't make sense because Grandma barely knew me compared to her. I reminded them that I visited Grandma every Sunday for 4 years, while they saw her maybe 6 times total after Grandpa died. I drove her to medical appointments, helped her grocery shop, and listened to her complain about how lonely she was. My mom said that was different because I didn't have anything else going on in my life anyway, while she was busy working and raising Blair and Jackson. Blair appeared in my doorway around 8:30 asking what time this mysterious lawyer was supposed to show up. She said she'd been Googling inheritance laws and found out that wills can be contested if the beneficiary manipulated the deceased person. She suggested that maybe I convinced Grandma to change her will by spending time with her and making her think the family didn't care about her. I told Blair she was welcome to contest the will in court if she wanted to spend thousands of dollars on legal fees and drag this out for months. I explained that Grandma had the will professionally drafted by a law firm and was completely mentally competent when she signed it. Blair said that was exactly what someone would say if they were trying to cover up elder manipulation. At 9:45 a.m., Jackson came upstairs and said he could see a black sedan pulling into our driveway. My dad looked out my bedroom window and asked if that was really a lawyer. I told them they'd find out in about 5 minutes and suggested they might want to go downstairs to answer the door. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 a.m. I could hear my mom talking to someone at the front door, then footsteps coming up the stairs. She appeared with a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase who introduced herself as Orlando from the law firm handling my grandmother's estate. Orlando asked if I was ready to review the documentation we'd discussed over the phone. My family stood there watching as Orlando opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of papers. She handed me the original deed to the house, showing that my grandmother had purchased it from the bank 18 months before her death. She explained that Grandma had been quietly paying off my parents' mortgage as a gift, but decided to transfer ownership to me instead of them after observing family dynamics during holidays and family gatherings. Orlando handed me another document showing that my parents had been making their mortgage payments to my grandmother's estate account for the past 3 years, which meant they'd technically been paying rent to me since I inherited the property. She said the monthly payments had been automatically deposited into an account that I could access whenever I wanted. My mom asked Orlando if this meant they didn't actually own their house anymore. Orlando explained that legally, my parents had been tenants for 3 years without realizing it. My dad asked what that meant for their living situation. Orlando said that was between me and them, but as the property owner, I had the legal right to establish lease terms or begin eviction proceedings if necessary. Blair demanded to know how much money we were talking about. Orlando calculated that my parents had paid approximately $14,400 over 3 years, plus the property had increased in value since Grandma bought it. She estimated the house was now worth about $40,000 more than what Grandma originally paid. Jackson asked if I was seriously going to kick them out of their own house. I corrected him that it wasn't their house and never had been. I explained that Grandma left me the house specifically because she watched how they treated me at family gatherings and decided I was the only grandchild who actually cared about her as a person, rather than just what she might leave behind. My mom started crying and asked Orlando if there was any way to reverse this or buy the house from me. Orlando said property transfers were certainly possible, but would need to be negotiated between the parties involved. She asked if I wanted to discuss lease agreements or if I preferred to handle this privately with my family. I told Orlando that I'd like to set up formal lease agreements for everyone living in the house, with individual terms based on their contributions to household expenses and their behavior toward me as the landlord. My dad asked what kind of terms I was thinking about. I said that would depend on whether they continued treating me like garbage or started showing some respect for the person who now controlled their housing situation. Orlando packed up her paperwork and said she'd prepare whatever legal documents I requested. She handed me business cards and explained that I could call any time to discuss property management options, including professional rental agreements or sale procedures if I decided to go that route. After Orlando left, my family sat in the living room, staring at each other in complete silence for about 10 minutes. Then Blair asked if I was really going to become their landlord. I said that was exactly what had already happened 3 years ago. They just hadn't known it yet. The best part? I haven't even started the real revenge yet. This was just establishing the power dynamic. Wait until you see what happens when I explain their new lease terms. Update 2. Reddit. The comments on my last update were absolutely brutal, and I'm living for every single one of them. The person who said my family sounds like entitled freeloaders who needed a wake-up call was spot on. And yes, to answer the most common question, this is 100% real and about to get so much better. So after Orlando left yesterday, my family spent about 2 hours in the living room having what can only be described as a complete meltdown. I could hear my mom crying and my dad pacing around asking how this was even possible. Blair kept saying there had to be some mistake and maybe we should get a second opinion from another lawyer. Jackson suggested that maybe Grandma was senile when she made the will and we could prove it somehow. Around 1 p.m., they finally asked me to come downstairs for a family meeting. My dad had apparently appointed himself as the spokesperson and said they needed to understand what my intentions were regarding their living situation. He asked if I was planning to evict them or if we could work out some kind of reasonable arrangement that would benefit everyone. I sat down at the kitchen table and told them I'd spent the last 3 years thinking about this exact conversation. I explained that I'd watched them treat me like a failure and a burden while I was actually subsidizing their lifestyle without them even knowing it. My mom interrupted and said they never treated me badly. They just had different expectations for their children based on their individual potential. That's when I asked her to explain what she meant by individual potential. She said Blair had obvious artistic talent that deserved nurturing, and Jackson was still figuring out his path in college, but I had never shown ambition or drive in anything meaningful. She said my job at the warehouse was fine for someone with limited goals, but it wasn't the kind of career that indicated long-term success potential. I asked my mom if she remembered last Christmas when she introduced me to her coworkers at the holiday party. She got quiet and said she remembered the party but not specifically how she introduced me. I reminded her that she introduced Blair as her daughter the artist, Jackson as her son the college student, and me as just her other kid who works at a warehouse. She said she didn't remember saying it exactly like that and maybe I was being overly sensitive about casual conversation. Blair jumped in and said she didn't understand why I was bringing up old family dynamics when we needed to focus on the current housing situation. She said regardless of past conversations, we were all family and needed to figure out how to move forward together. I told her she was absolutely right about moving forward together, which is why I'd prepared individual lease agreements for each of them. I pulled out a folder with 4 separate rental contracts that I'd been working on with Orlando over the past few months. Yes, Reddit. I've been planning this for months. Ever since my mom made a comment about how I'd probably never amount to anything and would end up living in their basement forever. That comment was the final straw that made me decide to stop hiding the inheritance. My dad asked what kind of lease agreements I was talking about. I explained that since they were now officially tenants, they needed individual contracts based on their specific circumstances and contributions to the household. I handed him his lease first. His rent was going from $0 to $1,200 monthly, due on the first of each month, with a security deposit of $2,400 required within 30 days. My dad stared at the contract and said $1,200 was more than their old mortgage payment. I reminded him that he hadn't been paying the mortgage for 3 years anyway. He'd been paying rent to Grandma's estate. I explained that 1200 was actually below market rate for a house this size in our neighborhood, and it included utilities that he'd been getting for free. My mom asked to see her lease next. Her rent was 800 monthly since she was only part-time at the medical office, but her contract included a clause requiring her to contribute equally to all household cleaning and maintenance. No more expecting me to do dishes or laundry while she complained about how messy I was. Her security deposit was also $800. Blair practically snatched her contract out of my hands. Her rent was set at 600 monthly, which sent her into an immediate rage because she said there was no way she could afford that on zero income. I told her that was exactly the point. She needed to get a job within 60 days or find alternative housing arrangements. Her lease also included a clause prohibiting the use of any common areas for art projects, meaning no more paint and supplies taking over the kitchen table and living room. Blair started yelling that I was trying to sabotage her artistic development and that real artists needed space and time to create without worrying about mundane jobs. I asked her how she planned to be a real artist without any income to buy supplies or support herself. She said most successful artists had family support during their developmental years, and this was exactly the kind of petty revenge that would destroy her creative potential. Jackson looked at his lease and immediately said there was no way he could pay $400 monthly while attending community college. I told him his lease also included a requirement to maintain a 3.0 GPA and contribute 10 hours weekly to household maintenance tasks. If his grades dropped below 3.0 or he missed his maintenance requirements, his rent would increase to $600 monthly. My mom asked if I was seriously expecting all of them to come up with security deposits within 30 days, when my dad was currently unemployed and Blair had no income. I said that was their problem to figure out, not mine. I'd been paying rent to them while secretly being their landlord for 3 years, so they'd had plenty of time to save money from the payments I was making. My dad asked what would happen if they couldn't meet these requirements. I explained that failure to pay rent or security deposits would result in formal eviction proceedings, and they'd have 30 days to find alternative housing. Blair asked if I was really going to put my own family on the street over money. I asked her if she was really expecting to live rent-free in someone else's house while contributing nothing to household expenses. Then Jackson asked the question I'd been waiting for. He wanted to know why I was being so harsh about this instead of just working out a reasonable family arrangement. I told him I'd spent the last 3 years listening to them talk about me like I was a failure and a disappointment while I was actually supporting their lifestyle. I'd heard every comment about how I'd never amount to anything and how Blair's art career was more important than my warehouse job. My mom said those conversations were never meant to hurt me and were just honest family discussions about everyone's different strengths and life paths. I asked her if she thought it was an honest family discussion when she told her sister on the phone last month that she was worried I'd end up being a 30-year-old loser still living in their basement. She said she didn't remember that specific conversation and maybe I was misunderstanding the context. Blair demanded to know if I'd been eavesdropping on private family conversations and using them against everyone. I told her there was nothing private about conversations that happened in the common areas of the house that I actually owned. I explained that I'd been keeping track of their comments about my lack of potential and their assumptions about my future for years. My dad asked if there was any way to negotiate these lease terms or if they were completely non-negotiable. I said the terms were based on fair market rates and reasonable expectations for adult tenants. If they wanted to negotiate, they were welcome to find comparable housing elsewhere and see what the rental market looked like for a family of 4 with limited income. The best part was watching them realize that they'd created this entire situation by treating me like garbage, while I was actually holding all the power. Blair asked if I was enjoying making them grovel after years of feeling superior to me. I told her I wasn't enjoying anything about this situation, but I was definitely planning to collect every dollar they owed me in back rent and security deposits. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with Orlando to finalize the eviction timeline and discuss property management options. My family has until Friday to sign their leases and pay their security deposits, or they get 30 days notice to vacate. And Reddit, based on their current financial situation, I'm pretty sure I know which option they're going to have to choose. Final update. Reddit. I cannot believe how this turned out. The commenter who predicted my family would try every manipulation tactic in the book before Friday was absolutely right. The person who said they'd probably end up homeless was also spot on. This is going to be a long update because you all deserve to know how this epic revenge story finally ended. Thursday night at 11 p.m., my dad knocked on my door and asked if we could have one final conversation before the Friday deadline. He said he'd been making phone calls all week trying to figure out their options, and the reality was setting in that they couldn't meet my lease requirements. He'd applied to 12 jobs since Monday and gotten 2 callbacks, But even if he got hired immediately, no employer was going to pay him enough upfront to cover first month's rent plus security deposits for 4 people. I told him I understood their financial situation was difficult, but that wasn't my problem to solve. He asked if I could at least extend the deadline by 30 days to give them more time to save money and find employment. I reminded him that they'd had 3 years of reduced housing costs to save money while I was unknowingly subsidizing their lifestyle, so 30 extra days wasn't going to change their fundamental financial problems. My mom appeared in my doorway and said she'd been thinking about this situation from a different angle. She asked if I would consider selling them the house through some kind of owner financing arrangement, where they could make payments directly to me instead of getting a bank mortgage. I asked her what they planned to use for a down payment, when they couldn't even afford security deposits. She said maybe we could work out a deal where their 3 years of previous payments counted as a down payment toward purchase. I explained that their previous payments were rent for living in the house, not purchase installments. You don't get to live somewhere for 3 years and then claim you were accidentally buying it the whole time. My mom said she understood the legal technicalities, but from a family perspective, shouldn't there be some consideration for the fact that they'd been making good faith payments without knowing the true ownership situation? Blair came upstairs around midnight and said she'd been researching tenant rights and found out that landlords couldn't just arbitrarily set rental rates without considering local market conditions. She demanded to know if I'd gotten professional appraisals to justify my pricing. I told her she was welcome to challenge my rates in court if she thought they were unreasonable, but that would require hiring a lawyer and probably cost more than just paying the rent. Blair said she'd found a legal aid clinic that might help them fight the eviction if I tried to force them out. I asked her what grounds they thought they had to fight an eviction for non-payment of rent. She said maybe they could argue that I'd created an unconscionable contract by springing these lease terms on them without proper notice. I reminded her that I'd given them a full week to review the contracts, which was more notice than most landlords provide. Jackson joined this midnight family meeting and said he'd been talking to his friends about the situation. Apparently, several of them thought it was incredibly messed up that I was basically making my own family homeless over money. He asked if I cared more about proving a point than maintaining family relationships. I asked him if he thought it was messed up when they spent years treating me like a loser while I was actually supporting their household expenses. My dad said he understood that I felt disrespected by some of their past comments, but that didn't justify destroying their housing security over hurt feelings. He asked if there was anything they could do to make amends for their previous behavior and earn some kind of family discount on the rental terms. I told him the time for making amends was before they decided to divide up my belongings and convert my bedroom into Blair's art studio. My mom asked what would happen to Blair's art supplies and Jackson's college textbooks if they had to move out quickly. I said they should have thought about that before assuming they could kick me out of my own room. Blair started crying and said I was destroying her artistic development out of petty revenge, and that real family members would support each other's dreams instead of sabotaging them. I reminded Blair that real family members wouldn't spend months planning to move someone to the basement without bothering to ask them first. I asked her when exactly she'd planned to inform me that she'd decided my bedroom was now her art studio. She said they weren't trying to hurt me, they just needed to make better use of the available space in the house based on everyone's different needs. Friday morning at 9 a.m. My entire family was waiting in the kitchen when I came downstairs for breakfast. My dad had prepared a formal presentation with handwritten charts showing their monthly budget and projected income if he found employment. He asked for one final extension of the deadline while they figured out their next steps. I told them the deadline was firm and asked if they had signed lease agreements and security deposit payments ready. My mom handed me an envelope with a check for $400 and said this was everything they could scrape together from their savings accounts. She asked if I would accept partial security deposits and allow them to pay the remainder over the next few months. I looked at the check and told them $400 wouldn't even cover one person's security deposit, let alone deposits for all 4 of them. Blair said she'd applied to 6 retail jobs this week but hadn't heard back from any of them yet. She asked if I would give her until the end of the month to find employment and start making rent payments. I reminded her that unemployment wasn't my problem to solve, and other landlords wouldn't give her special consideration just because finding a job was taking longer than expected. Jackson said his college advisor had suggested he might qualify for additional financial aid that could help with living expenses. He wanted to know if I would accept financial aid money as a rent payment. I told him he was welcome to use whatever income sources he wanted to pay rent, but the amount owed wasn't changing based on where the money came from. At 10 a.m., I called Orlando and told her my family had failed to meet the lease requirements by the Friday deadline. She asked if I wanted to proceed with formal eviction notices. I said yes and asked how long they would have to vacate the property. Orlando explained that I needed to give them 30 days written notice, and if they weren't out by then, I could file for legal eviction through the court system. Orlando arrived at 11 a.m. with official eviction notices for each family member. She handed them each a document stating they had 30 days to vacate the premises due to failure to execute rental agreements and provide required security deposits. My dad asked Orlando if there was any legal way to challenge these eviction notices. Orlando said they could respond through the court system if they believed the evictions were improper, but they would need to hire their own legal representation. My mom asked Orlando what would happen to their belongings if they couldn't find a new place to live within 30 days. Orlando explained that any personal property left on the premises after the eviction date would be considered abandoned and disposed of according to state law. Blair asked if that meant I could just throw away her art supplies and portfolios. Orlando said property left by evicted tenants typically gets donated or discarded after a brief holding period. The best part happened on Tuesday, exactly 3 days after the eviction notices were served. I was at my new job interview when my phone started buzzing with voicemail notifications. I had 17 missed calls and 12 voicemails from my family. The messages were absolutely unhinged. My mom was crying and begging me to reconsider the eviction because they'd found an apartment but needed first month's rent plus deposit money that they didn't have. Blair left 3 separate voicemails screaming about how I was a vindictive psychopath who was destroying her life and her art career over petty family drama. She said she hoped I was happy knowing that I'd made my own sister homeless and ruined her chances of ever becoming a successful artist. Jackson called me every name in the book and said he was going to have to drop out of college because they couldn't afford housing near campus anymore. The final voicemail was from my dad, recorded from their car in the parking lot of some budget motel. He said they'd managed to get a room for 3 days, but couldn't afford to stay longer. He begged me to at least give them back their security deposit money so they could rent a cheap apartment across town. I called him back and reminded him that they'd never actually paid security deposits, so there was nothing to give back. My family spent their last day on the lawn in front of the house, surrounded by garbage bags full of their belongings, making a scene for the entire neighborhood to see. Blair was crying and yelling that her own brother had stolen her family's house and kicked them onto the street. Several neighbors came over to ask what was happening, and I had to explain that these people were former tenants who'd been legally evicted for non-payment of rent. The woman who lives next door asked if I was really the new owner of the house. I showed her the deed and explained that I'd inherited the property from my grandmother 3 years ago. She said she'd been wondering why the house had seemed so much quieter lately and asked if I was planning to rent it out to new tenants. I told her I was keeping it as my primary residence and looking forward to having more respectful neighbors than my previous tenants. Reddit, I know some of you are going to say this was harsh, but these people spent years treating me like garbage while I was literally paying their living expenses. They assumed I was a loser with no potential while I was actually the person keeping a roof over their heads. The best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting even through completely legal means that they created themselves through years of disrespect. Blair lost her art studio, Jackson had to change colleges, my parents lost their house, and I gained complete control over my living situation. They're currently staying in a 2-bedroom apartment 40 minutes away that costs them more in rent than my lease terms would have. Sometimes the loser surprises everyone by actually holding all the cards the entire time.